あら、ドクター、また契約書？はいはい、サインしてあげるからこれ以上私を煩わせないこと。これでいいでしょ。先に言っておくけど、この C が描いた絵はあげられないわよ。誰にもあげないの。リクエストも受けないから。
Dusk is a limited 6-star AoE caster that specializes in dealing decent damage as well as crowd control. With her talents, Sublimity, when Dusk or a Freeling defeats an enemy, Dusk gains an attack bonus up to a certain amount of stacks. Her second talent, Finishing Touch, makes the first attack after deployment summon a Freeling at the target location. So this Freeling creature is basically a summon, except it doesn't require any deployment slots. So, stats-wise, Dusk has pretty much the same attack as Ifrit, which is definitely on the higher end of her archetype. She pretty much has the joint highest attack, being about 100 attack higher than Mastima as the other 6-star AoE caster. It is worth noting, though, that since I don't have Dusk to 100% trust, her attack is a little bit lower. This attack amount does go up to 110, so if I had 100% trust, she would basically have 900 attack. So, moving on to her skills. Her skill 1 increases the damage and splash area of the next attack, and this skill can hold multiple charges. So this is very similar to Ifrit, actually, in that she can really do consistent burst damage if there isn't a lot of enemies that go within her attack range. So when it says increase the splash area, it changes the attack radius from the 4 surrounding tiles to all 8 surrounding tiles. And with Mastery 1, it can hold 3 charges. Dusk's skill 2 increases her range, attack speed, and attacks all enemies within range, with the added benefit of increasing the arts damage dealt to enemies with less than 50% HP to 130%. So this skill is basically an upgraded version of Gitano's skill 2, and this provides more burst damage with a short duration. And finally, her skill 3 is very interesting, to say the least. It increases her attack interval, meaning she attacks even slower and prioritizes attacking unblocked enemies. Range and splash area expand, deals plus 100% attack at skill 7, and every attack summons a mini creature to block enemies. So it makes it so instead of being an AoE caster, she becomes a summoner while dealing high damage. One thing to note here with the Freeling is that each Freeling has 2,000 hit points, 300 defense, and 50 res, and 2 block. So, especially against arts damage, they are very tanky. And since Dusk refreshes them every attack, it can be very useful for stalling enemies. But unfortunately, though, they have relatively low attack, so anything with high defense, they're not going to do much towards. But overall, this skill is really for just stalling enemies.
にくいね。書いてあげる。
As for base buffs, Dusk has a very bizarre buff, to say the least. So her first buff is Unstirred by Gain. When an operator is assigned to the control center, decreases the morale by all operators in the control center by 0.05, which is fairly standard. When own morale is below 12, Worldly Plight plus 15. So what that means is that Dusk adds to Mr. Nothing's trading post effect. And then Unmoved by Loss, when this operator is assigned to the control center, it increases morale consumption when own morale is above 12, but perception information is plus 10. And then this adds to the effectiveness of Rose Mantis's base buff. So what I find to be really irritating about this buff is that both of them are dependent on how much morale Dusk has, so you have to keep a little bit more in mind of how much morale is left. But on top of that, the first buff, you have to have Mr. Nothing to Elite 2 to get any benefit from it, and then the second one affects a limited operator. So, all in all, for her base buff, there's quite a high amount of investment needed in other operators, or in the case of Romantis, you're a rundum for her limited banner in order to gain benefit from Dusk, and then also keep in mind her morale amounts. In summary, Dusk, being of the AoE caster archetype, she does suffer from the three main weaknesses of this archetype, being very high deployment costs, very slow attack speed, and very limited range. Thankfully, Dusk, though, solves at least 2 out of those 3 issues with her skill 2 and skill 3, and to some degree with her skill 1. With the extra range and attack speed of skill 2, and then skill 3 having that very wide range, and since her summons block enemies, the increased attack interval isn't as big of a problem as it might seem on paper. So for mastery recommendations, if you do go forward with Elite 2ing Dusk, I would suggest, it's up to you whether or not you want to get her skill 1 any mastery levels. I would suggest probably mastery 1 just to get the 3 charges, and the AoE, like I said, is the 8 surrounding tiles, so that's what this is for, is showing the AoE there. And then skill 2, I think, is probably her, if you want Dusk to focus on dealing damage, M3ing this skill is probably a good idea. And then for skill 3, I put mastery 1 here, because going from skill 7 to mastery 1 gives you 10% attack, whereas mastery 2 and mastery 3 only give you 5% each. So with the resource cost, mastery 1 I think is a bit bigger. So overall, my thoughts on Dusk is she is definitely higher up there for her archetype. Usually for AoE casters, because of their limited range and the slow attack speed and high deployment costs that I mentioned earlier, they're not really favored very well. And so they're basically more so you have to have a choke point that you funnel the enemies into, and then have one of these casters at one of these choke points. So when I mentioned that Dusk kind of solves at least 2 out of those 3 issues, I think she's definitely one of the better, if not one of the best, of this archetype. Though, I think Ifrit is still a little bit better to use because of how high the damage Ifrit does, as well as the resistance shred. But I think with her skill 3 definitely having a ton of potential. So if you are going to get Dusk, I would suggest getting her to at least Elite 2 level 40, just because of how much attack you gain for the high-end attack for AoE casters. And one thing that I want to mention as well is that for the base buffs, it doesn't look like you need to Elite 2 Dusk in order to get the second skill, just like Nyan, which is pretty nice, even though that I'm still baffled by Dusk's base buffs. So overall, would I recommend getting Dusk, since she is a limited operator? Well, I would say you can't go wrong with going for Dusk. She provides a lot of uniqueness to your team, but the problem is that the timing of her limited banner is definitely questionable because of the Rainbow Six Siege collaboration event is pretty much right after this, and so having 2 limited banners back to back is definitely really hard for free-to-play players. So I kind of want to recommend the Rainbow Six Siege characters, Ashe especially, because since they're collaboration, they're effectively ultra-limited characters, and as far as I know, there isn't any news of them ever coming back after that event. So, again, I don't think you can go wrong with getting Dusk. She has a lot of potential, and I had watched a video showing both Mastima and Dusk, and even though that having 2 AoE casters on the same team might seem a little redundant on some maps, I think their synergy works really well with one another, because Mastima has the SP recharge of casters, and then Dusk has the stalling of her summons. So overall, I think my biggest issue with recommending Dusk is primarily just because of that collaboration timing. Other than that, I think she has a lot of potential, especially within possibly contingency contract, and if the Kyobi's fungi mist ever comes back, I can see her doing very well there. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this made you decide whether or not to put out extra random for Dusk or not, and have a wonderful day.